And then there's always the sound check to make certain that I don't have an echo to YouTube with the preview. Arlene said that she is not able to make it this week. She has something else on her plate. I think friends coming over. So we'll be missing Arlene today. And Susan, of course, her schedule is all up in the air. So yes, we're keeping Susan very much in our prayers right now. And we just lost, oh, well, I'll keep an eye on the participants list. And I thought that Diane's service might be hitching a little bit because I thought that I saw her kind of freeze in place. So, and there she is again. There's Diane. Wonderful. We kind of vamped while waiting for you to hop back in, Diane. But yes, let's have a moment of prayer, and then we'll get right into these scriptures for today. Almighty and merciful God, as we talk so much about history of the church, history of people, history of nations, let us take a moment to talk about her story and to actually hear the voices of women whose voices have long been silenced, or words attributed to women in these stories actually spoken through the lens of male relatives. Help us to actually feel your hope and your love, your encouragement and your support. Help us to know how these stories, difficult, raw, very tough to hear, how can we take hope into the future from these stories? In your name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, so let me pull up my normal outline. I believe, if I remember correctly, that the first story that I shared was from Genesis, and it was Hagar's story. And let's see here. I have a long spreadsheet of all of these, and I shared the spreadsheet with some friends. And at that point, I had to unhide some of the tabs that I had previously hidden. And so now everything is all over the place. But the first story on the list is Hagar, Genesis 16. And I only put down verses 1 through 6. The story itself is, of course, much longer. But Hagar is a very interesting character for a number of reasons. The next story that I shared was Dinah, also in Genesis, chapter 34, verses 1 through 7. And again, I just shared a small little snippet because these stories are long, and I am always one for context. And so we'll probably be talking about more of the context than we just read about. But I then wanted to save room for more of the story about the person who's normally called the Levites Concubine, and I changed how I'm referring to her as the Levites young girl wife. I think that she would have been a second wife, and again, a very vulnerable position. And she's called concubine in the text, and yet her father is called the Levite's father-in-law, and the Levite is referred to as her husband, and she isn't given the courtesy of being called a wife. So I admit it, I changed the language. And then the last story is very much the end of the story that starts with the Levite and his young girl wife. And there's lots of murder and mayhem and shenanigans in between. But let's start with the easy one, Hagar. So this is Genesis 16, verses 1 through 6. Would anyone in particular like to read?
I'll read.
Thanks.
And is it Sarai? Is that?
Yes, at this point in the text, she's Sarai.
Right.
And once the H goes on, then it's Sarah.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I sometimes feel like I need to say that with a question. So my question, there's so much, even in just this short little story. Now it goes on, Hagar goes into the wilderness, and she is actually one of the first female voices who truly argues back with God. In fact, one of the first voices that argues back with God, because before this, you'll have people accepting God's word, and by people, I should have actually clarified. Men in the text, they will accept God's word. They might respond, but it's all very, I will do as you say, Lord. But Hagar argues with God. And she stands up for herself. She's also actually one of the first people who names God. And most of the men in the text before this will ask God to name God's self and to tell them who to call God by. And Hagar in verse 13 of this chapter actually gives God a name, which I find very interesting. But back to the verses that Denise read, my question is, who is telling this story? Whose perspective is this? Who is saying that Hagar looked with contempt upon Sarai? It's, and what might the point of view from where these stories are being told? Why might they have interpreted what's going on in that way?
Well, it's my understanding in that time that was common.
Yeah.
If you couldn't bear children, to have a slave bear children.
Mm-hmm. So you have a woman who is feeling the burden of oppression of the culture, taking someone who is in her power, a slave, and saying, well, here, just, and it's furthering the oppression. It's treating someone else the way that she has been treated. Let's see, the study guide question that I put out was Sarah and Hagar, which I actually should have wrote as Sarai and Hagar, are both trapped in a patriarchal culture. And Sarah treats Hagar the way she has been treated. Sarah was the victim of oppression, but instead of using her hurt to wake up and find ways to lift Hagar up so both women could support each other, Sarah instead mistreats Hagar. How does this reflect tone-deaf awareness movements throughout history? What can the Sarahs in the world do to actually help the Hagars in need?
With so many of these stories, it's all about power.
Yes.
Every time, and even with her,
Yep.
it's about power over her slave girl, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too. And I do feel unprepared because I haven't really been here this summer and I don't know the context of, I'm sure you guys covered the context of women in that day. So
A little bit.
there's a lot that I missed there, but it is interesting. And it was the same thing with Leah and Rachel, you know, I can't have a child, but my slave will have the child and that child will be mine, you know? And so that's, you know, it's not only do you own the slave, but then you
own the child.
the child too.
Take possession of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's beyond just owning the child. It's taking possession of. It's child stealing. It's forced adoption
Right.
in some ways.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's surrogate mothership, but it's not with anyone's permission.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And why might Sarai have felt that Hagar was looking with contempt?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Who's telling this story? Hagar doesn't actually tell any of her story until she runs away.
Mhm.
That's
Right.
the first thing. That's the first thing that she has power over. Yeah.
Well, I would think it would be Sorry telling the story, wouldn't it?
Mhm. Yeah, you're right that that in many ways Sarai is the one that is telling the story, and you see how she is reacting to what's going on in the situation. And it's incredible, actually, that you do have the story told from Sarai's point of view, because last week with Yael, even though in that story she was saying things in the story, as I then did in the sermon, I showed how her story, even with her words, it wasn't actually told from her point of view. It didn't reflect what she was feeling. It reflected what the Israelites thought and what what people who have condemned her thought. But you definitely are going to have to watch it, Denise.
Couldn't it be as simple as Sarai just being jealous? I mean, I don't know what other emotion she would have to react that way, except she's jealous that the girl, because it sounds like he got her pregnant and that was it, but we don't know.
Right.
True.
Maybe he ended up with a relationship with her. We don't know that. And maybe that's why she reacted, the way she did.
And it is kind of hard to blame her too, right? Because she's the victim, right? She lives in a culture where her value is based on whether or not she has children.
Right.
So I'm sure at this point she's like freaking out, right? Like, I have no value, I have no worth.
Yep.
What do I have? Well, I have control over this fertile woman who's going to do whatever I instruct her to do. So she actually sets this up, right? She's like, okay, the least I can do is have my husband reproduce through my slave. But then, right, she becomes pregnant. And you're right, there's no kind of what she's defining as despise, right? So then, but then she goes to him and she's like, kind of, you did this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
This
she's
is
really
her
not.
fault.
Right. She's trapped in this culture.
Yeah.
Sarai is trapped in this culture, and then she further traps another person.
Right.
Mm.
And you're right, she doesn't have her own power because of the culture, that patriarchal culture that was so about, the man's shame and or honor. And the only way that a woman has any value was through the number of children that she had. And so it perpetuates this power, as you said, Diane, this,
it's like Handmaid's Tale, like
it is. It really is.
Oh, I know.
And so often, we look at cultures like the Taliban, that's, and we say things about, how awful it is that they treat women this way. And yet And this is in our own history, this same way of treating women. So, you know, when we're saying that, you know, that the Taliban is awful, we have it too. You know, we can't actually cast that stone without saying our own history of treatment is not good. It has these same things. So if
Well,
we're
it's
going
not just history, it's now.
It's now.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's now.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, and that brings up a point, you know, it's the, and kind of how women kind of betraying women. So, you know, that's when you benefit from a patriarchal society. So if you're a white female married to a powerful white male, actually, Diana and I have had this conversation. I think
I bet. I'm so excited. I
so
think you will leave this a lot.
but you have a vested interest in maintaining that patriarchal society because you benefit from it.
Yes.
So, you know, so it's really easy to look at, say, you know, Black and brown women or women who are impoverished, women who don't benefit from the patriarchal society. And it's easy to like other them, to them. And, you know, just again, well, this is a great world. I benefit from it. I'm a woman, you know, so it's so, you know, to take your own experience and apply that to everybody. So that's just a very triggering topic for me as Diana.
As it should be. It should be.
Yeah.
So Hagar. You know, we've talked a lot about Sarai. Hagar. What is Hagar's story? In these 6 verses, what is Hagar's story?
It's sad, actually. Yeah.
Now here she is. She's enslaved to someone who has complete control over her. You know, anything that she has is owned by someone else. She doesn't even own her own body. She is forced into this situation. She is forced into having sexual relations with someone who's probably old enough to be her grandfather. And she is raped. And she gets pregnant from that. And maybe Abram, you know, tried to shower her with gifts or whatever. We don't know what he does. We have no clue. But
and
yes,
she's in this position through no control or no fault of her own. She was born into this situation. So I think that's an important fact to kind of put out there, that these are not, you know, there are circumstances that people are in that are truly by no control of their own, and who will probably never have any opportunity to change their circumstances through their own means. So I think that's a really important point to make. And I say that because applying that to today, there is a lot of we create our own destiny, or we're responsible for our choices, or we can change our choices. And the truth is that is not true for everyone.
Right.
It's true for Sarai's.
Right.
And actually, it's really only true for Abrams, whether they are male or female, because even Sarai, you know, she doesn't even have the control over her name change.
Right.
That comes up a few chapters later. So yeah, it's a story of oppression. It's a story of control. It's a story of power, and it's the story of a girl who's enslaved, who has no control over her own destiny, saying at the very end, the only thing that I can do is run away.
But I find it interesting too that all of these stories, I mean, in the end, there's Ishmael.
Yes.
So again, you have a line So all these stories of really women being abused, there seems to be a child there that then gets into the whole
Right.
line or the history, which is
Yeah.
interesting. These women are
Yeah.
being used. They have
Yep.
a child.
And everything's
Then
all good.
Every-
Yeah, I actually just found on my shelves this book, which is Battered Love by Benita Weems. And so it's going to go on my to be read this week list, because it's one that I read a couple chapters for in seminary, but I think that it's going to have a lot of things to say, because the secondary line on it is marriage, sex, and violence in the Hebrew prophets. And while this is Genesis, and the Hebrew prophets that it talks about come later, there's a lot of these stories of the analogy of marriage and violence that really comes into play. And while I know that we've got more to say about this one, I'm actually going to move us along to Dinah.
Can I just say quickly, I read someplace when I was looking stuff up too, that rape had different meanings
Yes.
in that time as to what they considered rape, or I forgot what the other word was they used, but yeah, I found that interesting. Rape wasn't just rape.
Yeah.
And rape was about honor.
It was about honor, and it was about whether a male was violated in some way.
Right.
It didn't apply to women.
Hmm.
So our next story, Dinah, which in my NRSV Bible has the subheading "The Rape of Dinah."
Yeah.
Dinah, so Genesis chapter 34, verses 1 through 7. And again, the story itself is a lot longer. But I only decided to share these couple of verses because it sets up the story. You have the major players are Dinah, who has 12 brothers. You have her father. You have the culture of a religiously restrictive culture, that would be the Israelites, living in Canaanite land. And so you have, people trying to both keep their cultural identity, that is to say, Jacob's family, they're trying to keep their cultural identity, which means that they would feel dishonor if Dinah married outside their culture. But then you have Dinah, who she is going out and exploring. She's meeting the other women in this land around her. So would anyone like to read these 7 verses? Or I can. Okay, I'm seeing nods. All right. Now, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the region. When Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the region, saw her, he seized her and lay with her by force. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this girl to be my wife." Now Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with his cattle in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him, just as the sons of Jacob came in from the field. When they heard of it, the men were indignant and very angry, because he had committed an outrage in Israel by laying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, I love the couple of sentences there where, he seized her and lay with her by force, and his soul was drawn to Dinah's daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Right. And so it's very easy to see why for so long this has been a story of rape.
Mhm,
Because you have that language of he seized her and he lay with her by force.
mhm.
But who's telling the story?
Right.
And
Is
in
the-
other versions, they use the word. So I had that, what did I had? One of the versions, I did Catholic version because it was Judith on one of
Yes.
the previous readings.
Yes.
And I actually had it up and they have the word, oh, wait, the NIV. Yep. The NIV has rape. They use the word rape.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah,
yeah.
The Good News says rape also.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the few times that you actually have the word rape applied in reference to a female victim.
Hmm.
But here's the thing, we have to remember who's telling the story. And it's Jacob and his sons who are telling the story.
Mhm.
And culturally speaking, they would have considered any relation with any male outside their culture as forceful, as an assault on their honor. So we don't actually know what happened with Dinah.
Hmm.
And it goes back to that tribal thing again. Everything that is done
Mm-hmm.
is for the tribe or for the family name or whatever to keep it pure.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. So I'm going to actually share another chapter or another verse from this Preaching the Women of the Old Testament that I've been using so heavily this summer. There are pages falling out of this book. I've used it so much. It is possible that Dinah was a flighty, needy, bored young woman, but the text does not say. The commentators develop an elaborate story from the brief statement that she went out to see the women of the time. This is commentators saying that, oh, well, Dinah deserved what happened to her because, she was stepping outside the tribe, yada, yada, yada. The story they tell justifies the blaming of Dinah. If she was not needy, neurotic, and lonely, she would not have gone out. If she was not superficial and interested in the clothes and jewels the women were wearing, she would not have gone out. If she were not so curious, she would not have gone out. Female independence makes some commentators very nervous. These interpretations raise questions about consent and illustrate the complexities of distinguishing between sexual assault and seduction. According to contemporary definitions of sexual assault, if Shechem took Dinah to his palace and sexually assaulted her, that was clearly rape. If he invited her to the palace, gave her dinner and wine, and then demanded sex as payment, that was rape. If he invited her to the palace, gave her food and wine, and she willingly kissed him, but said no when he demanded sex, that was rape. If the encounter was entirely based on mutual attraction and she was a willing partner, it was not rape, although Dinah's brothers would have disagreed. It is impossible to say definitely what happened and to what degree Shechem forced Dinah and to what degree she consented. There is not enough evidence to blame Dinah for her behavior.
Interesting.
It is. And it really challenges, because first of all, it's another one of these stories that you don't hear in Sunday school. Not really, not at all. And in terms of the lectionary, her story is not actually in the lectionary. So it's another one of these stories that we just don't hear because it's hard to talk about rape in church. Well, guess what I did last week? But yeah, when I was very challenged when I read Lynn Japinga's commentary, and I had to go back and read this and realize we don't actually know what happened to Dinah. We see her brother's interpretation, and the entire story is about even in the later verses. The entire story is about how Dinah's brothers are really compelling the narrative. We don't hear whether or not Dinah wanted to marry Shechem. We don't hear whether or not she felt that she had been violated. We don't know. And, we know that she went out to speak with the women of the village about who knows what. So we know that she was stepping outside the boundaries of her home. Did she think that she wouldn't be attacked? Did she think that she was completely safe? There's even less in this text to find out what happened than in some of the others. But it's one of the few texts where you have the very forceful language about rape applied to the interactions between a man and a woman.
But it's also interesting for all they did for her honor.
Mm-hmm.
Was that just an excuse to do
Right.
everything that they did?
Right, all the killing, all the
Because the way they thought of women in those days.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, all the killing and the stealing of people and animals, was that just an excuse? Oh, this is a way we can do this. We'll say it's in her honor.
Right. So yeah, it's a challenging story. And it's not an easy one. So let me see the study guide questions that I had. This story has long been used as a cautionary tale against women who are curious, who take initiative, who are independent. Commentators throughout history use the story to emphasize different ways that danger results when women step outside of the home. The story is actually written from the point of view of Jacob, Dinah's father, and her many brothers, with comments from Shechem and his father. Jacob and his sons do not approve of Shechem because his religion was different from their families. The brothers feel their honor was besmirched by Shechem's actions with or to Dinah, and the violent and ambiguous language reflects the feelings of the males in Dinah's family. Dinah's voice has been silenced. Was Dinah relieved to be free because of her brother's actions, or did she mourn the loss of Shechem? Why or why not?
And like you said, that we don't know, because we really don't know what her relationship was with him.
Yeah.
And it's almost interesting too, because when you read on and that was that a ploy, the whole circumcision and,
Right.
but then Jacob agrees, and then once the killing and the massacre happens, he's angry at them.
Yes.
Also. So that's also very interesting as well.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating story, and it uses Dinah as an excuse, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, I really think that, would this story have happened if Dinah hadn't been born? Yeah, it's a really, and we don't, there's no women around Dinah other than the women of the village, the women of the region who are mentioned at the very beginning of the story. There's no women in this story to help Dinah out through this. She's all alone. She has no one to talk to, and her brothers are going on a violent rampage throughout the region. It's a heartbreaking story. And her voice has been completely silenced in the text.
Which that is what makes you think she's just being used in it, because she has no voice.
Yep. Yeah. She is a vessel. Her brothers use her as a vessel for violence. Ooh, that's a sermon title. Yikes. I have to actually write that one down. A vessel for violence. Which actually brings us to our next one.
This one's this was
Oh,
just
this one-
unbelievable.
this
This
one
is
is-
horrible.
This is heartbreaking and awful.
It
And
is.
oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so Judges 19. It's really,
And yet you have to really read the whole thing.
you really
Yeah.
do. You really do, because otherwise it's one of those, you can't really pick it apart. And I somewhat abridged it for Sunday scripture reading. Still trying to keep the flavor of what's going on, but it's really hard.
Oh, yeah, this is probably one of the most like difficult for me. It's just, and again, it's that honor. Like,
Yes. Yep. Yep. And it's like, okay, whose honor? What, like, oh yeah. So, would you like me to read this one, or would
yeah, I don't want to read it.
I don't want to read it.
I will read it? Okay, and I'm going to read all of 19. So it's 30 verses, 30 very difficult verses. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite residing in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine became angry with him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for some 4 months. Then her husband set out after her to speak tenderly to her. There's that speak tenderly word again, and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. When he reached her father's house, the girl's father saw him and came with joy to meet him. His father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank, and he stayed there. On the 4th day, they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Fortify yourself with a bit of food, and after that you may go." So the 2 men sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Why not spend the night and enjoy yourself?" When the man got up to go, his father-in-law kept urging him until he spent the night there again. On the 5th day, he got up early in the morning to leave, and the girl's father said, "Fortify yourself." So they lingered until the day declined, and the 2 of them ate and drank. When the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Look, the day has worn on until it is almost evening. Spend the night. See, the day is drawn to a close. Spend the night here and enjoy yourself. Tomorrow you can get up early in the morning for your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He got up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was far spent, and the servant said to the master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will continue on to Gibeah." Then he said to his servant, "Come, let us try to reach one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to the Benjamin. When they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah, he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, but no one took them in to spend the night. Then at evening there was an old man coming from his work in the field. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was residing in Gibeah. The people of the place were Benjaminites. When the old man looked up and saw the wayfarer in the open square of the city, he said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" He answered him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to my home. Nobody has offered to take me in. We, your servants, have straw and fodder for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and the woman and the young man along with us. We need nothing more." The old man said, "Peace be with you. I will care for all your wants, only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him in to his house and fed the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. While they were enjoying themselves, the men of the city, a perverse lot, surrounded the house and started pounding on the door. They said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, so we may have intercourse with him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Ravish them and do whatever you want to them, but against this man, do not do such a vile thing." But the man would not listen to him. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and put her out to them. They wantonly raped her and abused her all through the night and until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. As morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. In the morning, her master got up, opened the doors of the house, and when he went out to go on his way, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her, "we are going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man set out for his home. When he had entered his house, he took a knife, and grasping his concubine, he cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. Then he commanded the men with whom he sent, saying, "Thus shall you say to all the Israelites, has such a thing ever happened since the day that the Israelites came up from the land of Egypt until this day? Consider it, take counsel, and speak out."
Mm.
Yeah.
So they use, the word concubine, which I always think of plural, but they don't use it that way. They're talking about her,
Yep.
right? Just her when he says
Just her.
concubine.
Yes.
Because I always think of it as plural, a concubine. You know what I mean? I
like a harem.
yes.
Ah,
And they're not using it that way.
right. Yeah, I've always heard it as a singular, but
Okay. I don't know why I think that. That might just be
It could just
something
be-
I think.
could just be different references.
So I had to keep, yeah, it threw me because I had to keep going. Well, no, they're talking about her,
Yeah,
the no name person.
the no
She
name.
had no name.
She had no name.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Yeah. Neither does the Levite, actually.
Right, right.
He's just the Levite, and with a capital L, important personage. And yes, she is just called his concubine. But yet
So-
he's called her
So
husband.
what is the reason for that story in there?
What is so? Yeah. So that story is the setup for the next 2 chapters
Okay.
of murder and mayhem and all kinds of awfulness. So the Levite sends out, he hacks up his wife, second wife, that's why she's called a concubine. But he hacks her to pieces. After she experiences this trauma, he further brutalizes her and sends these pieces out to the different tribes, of which, Benjamin was one of the tribes. And in the following chapters, there's this huge army that is formed on behalf of the Levites' honor, because he was violated in this story. Yes. And so all of these other tribes assemble in order to avenge the Levites' honor. And his wife, the concubine, is ignored basically from this point out. The other tribes, they make this pact with each other that none of them will agree to let any of the women in their household be married to a Benjamin.
Then they circumvent that as well.
Right. And that's the last story that I had shared was how they circumvented that, which actually, why don't I go into that part of the story as well, just so that we have the whole thing. So Judges 21, verses 15 through 25. Actually, I'm going to read all of chapter 21 because it sets up some of the story of this. Now the Israelites had sworn at Mitzpah, no one of us shall give a daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there until evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. They said, "Oh God, the Lord of Israel, why has it come to pass that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel?" That is to say that Benjamin, all of their women had been either taken by the other tribes or killed. So Benjamin tribe has no women. On the next day, the people got up early and built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of well-being. Then the Israelites said, "Which of the tribes of Israel did not come up to the assembly of the Lord?" For a solemn oath had been taken concerning whoever did not come up to the Lord of Mizpah, saying, "That one shall be put to death." But the Israelites had compassion for Benjamin and their kin and said, "One tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters as wives?" Then they said, "Is there anyone from the tribes of Israel who did not come up to the Lord to Mitzpah?" And it turned out that no one from the Jabesh Gilead had come up to the camp to the assembly. For when the roll was called among the people, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 soldiers there and commanded them, "Go put the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead to the sword, including the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman that is lain with a male you shall devote to destruction." And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had never slept with a man, and brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole congregation sent word to the Benjaminites who were at the rock at Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they did not suffice for them. The people had compassion on Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. So the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for the wives of those who are left, since there are no women left in Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be heirs for the survivors of Benjamin, in order that the tribe may not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give any of our daughters to them as wives, for the Israelites had sworn, 'Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to Benjamin.' So they said, 'Look, the yearly festival of the Lord is taking place at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebanai.' And they instructed the Benjamites, saying, 'Go and lie in wait at the vineyards and watch. When the young women of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards, and each of you carry off a wife for himself from the young women of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. Then if their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, be generous and allow us to have them, because we did not capture in battle a wife for each man. But neither did you incur the guilt of giving your daughters to them.' The Benjaminites did so. They took wives for each of them from the dancers whom they abducted. Then they went and returned to the territory and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. So the Israelites departed from there at that time by tribes and families, and they went out from there to their own territories. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and the people did what was right in their own eyes." Thus ends the book of Judges. So that is the conclusion of the story of the Levites concubine.
And there again, it's that getting those women so they can have children and keep the tribe going.
Yep.
Keep that line going.
And I love how they blamed God for the breach in the tribes of Israel.
Yes.
Yeah, these are not easy stories. These are definitely not easy stories by any stretch of the imagination. So I had a huge paragraph for study questions, or 2 paragraphs for study questions for both of these, and we don't have a lot of time. But I'll go
Did Harriet weigh in on any of this?
She did, and I
Okay.
haven't actually had a chance to read through hers, but I will bring it up right now. She has quite a lot to say. Judges 19, she says, it is important to know these stories as it shows the wickedness of many people in these regions. Also, the disregard for human life is at an unbelievable level. And it still is today.
Mm-hmm.
That's my own addition.
Right.
Harriet says, the most troubling for me was when the Levite gave his concubine, Bible's wording, to these terrible men. He knew they would do terrible things to her, and they did. He was also very evil and uncaring with ignoring her death and then cutting her in pieces and sending the 12 parts out to different regions in Israel. It does not challenge me to read, but the evil done is hard to understand. However, I realize these were different times, but were they really?
Mm-hmm.
There are still many bad things going on. Just listen or read the news right now, today or tomorrow or next week. The most troubling of the story was in my last answer. I think that, the previous about the girl being cut up. It does not stir. So she always responds very well to each of the questions that I put. So each thing that I read is a response to the questions that I have in the study guide questions. So the next thing that Harriet says is this story does not stir up my past life, but it is just plain hard to understand. It is no wonder that God sent Jesus to save people from sin. We still pray to them today that people will learn and be kinder to one another. It can start very small and grow in even in the simplest of situations. It is important to discuss the past, as we always learn. The more we understand, the more we are able to have our present life doing good and help others do right wrongs. This work is always ongoing. We can tell her story straightforward as we have read it. Not sure I want to read it aloud in a church service, however. Yeah.
But she's right. I mean, these stories you can apply to modern times. They're not as rough, I want to say. They're a little more nuanced things that go on. But you can certainly see the same things, certainly with men trying to control women's bodies comes to mind right up front.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, it's done in a more subtle way.
Sometimes
That's true. But certainly what just happened in Texas was unbelievable how they did that.
Yeah.
Just unbelievable how they managed that. The ins and outs of that are frightening.
Yep.
Absolutely frightening.
Yeah, it's all about control. It's all about, whose honor is it? Whose body is it?
Yeah.
One of the things that is striking to me about the beginning of Judges 19 is how concerned I read the father of the girl. You know, yes, he's whining and dining his son-in-law, but there's a reason why that father is delaying them leaving. There's a reason in there. And, you know, his daughter, she fled back. You know, she had been given in marriage, that a contract had been signed, you know, and yet she fled from that all the way back.
Which was a huge deal to do in those days. So it must have been pretty bad.
It must have
The
been
circumstances. Yeah.
Exactly. So even in this very patriarchal society where honor and shame, you know, the father of this girl could have, when she arrived back home, he could have put her on a donkey and send her right back.
Right. Right.
And he didn't.
Hmm.
It makes me wonder, why didn't he?
Hmm.
Why didn't he do that, which would have been culturally appropriate?
Hmm.
So he had, I read it as he had concern for his daughter.
I mean, she could have shown up bruised.
Yep.
Be able to visually see something.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But I
interesting.
think that was common practice. Like, I don't know if that would necessarily be a red flag, because the truth is the father probably did that to his wife and his concubines and his daughter, so abuse is just obviously rampant. I guess what I don't get is like, well, why go after her? Like, why did you go put all this expense? Like, clearly she's a concubine, so she must be the second wife or third
Yep.
or fourth, or,
Yep.
so she's not the primary wife. And then you travel all of this, and then only literally to throw her out like garbage.
Yep.
Like, literally, you went through all this effort. I mean, I have nothing like to wrap my head. There is nothing.
It's a really complicated story.
It is.
Yeah. And it so much about it doesn't make any sense. Now in Battered Love, there's a lot in it that talks about the metaphor of marriage. And the end of Judges, we then we get into Ruth is the next book in the Bible, but really we're beginning to get into First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and then after that, well, Chronicles, of course, but we're beginning to do that shift from the Judges into the Kings. And one of the things that overlapped a lot of the Kings was the major and minor prophets, because and then you move into the exile, etc. And so marriage and violence was used as an analogy. It was a very common analogy. And let's see if I can find the section.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to.
Oh my goodness, I didn't realize what time
out
it was
here. But thank you. Sorry.
Bye, Denise. It was really good to see you.
Bye.
You too. Bye. Let's see here. So just quickly. This again is from Battered Love. There's no reason to doubt the world of brutality, rape, and subjugation that the marriage metaphor assumes was a world with which Hebrew women were well acquainted. Indeed, the overwhelming evidence of Hebrew laws and narratives is that women were subordinate to men in both the public and private domains. Not only is male dominance assumed in the Old Testament, it is not questioned. This means then that not only does the metaphor of the adulterous wife play upon male fantasies and fears about female sexuality, the metaphor also reinforces androcentric notions about wives as husbands' property and promotes patriarchal visions of marriage as a hierarchical arrangement where husbands clearly have the upper hand. The image of the battered, promiscuous wife caters to patriarchal thinking in that it leaves unquestioned husbands' presumption that they have the authority to degrade and silence their wives when the latter act in ways that allegedly bring shame on their husbands. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that the rhetorical world the prophets proposed to ancient Hebrew women through the marriage metaphor was purely a creation of the prophets' literary imagination. There is no reason to suspect that the marriage metaphor had no basis in Hebrew social reality. In all likelihood, the world of romance and rape, taken for granted in the prophets' sexual rhetoric, was not a world inconceivable to ancient Hebrew women. Indeed, in a world where it was conceivable that women could be made to marry their rapists, it is quite possible that women also found themselves having to reconcile with husbands who battered and mutilated their bodies. And that is what we have to work with. these analogies that do not work with modern understanding, or I should say current understanding and sensibilities. And so we're left with these really difficult stories that we want to push aside and not talk about.
But they're there.
But they're there. But they're there. And when we can talk about them, and when we can say that this is wrong, we are actually in a better position to speak to
Right.
what we're seeing in Texas, which is, I've heard the phrase Texas Taliban. It's Christians who are doing that in Texas.
Yeah, it just, yeah. The more I read it, and to make it a vigilante type of a situation is so sad and just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Just unbelievable.
Yep.
And I just, these politicians who are men, it's power, because what other reason? They don't care once the child's born.
Nope.
They're not going to give them medical care or anything. So you just go, why? Is it just voter base and power? I don't know what else there is.
The unborn are a very easy group to advocate for.
Yeah.
Because they don't make any demands on you.
Right. Right.
There's no accountability. No nothing.
But
They
amazing. I want to say maybe Pat Adams had this on a post of a young girl is raped and has to carry that baby, but yet they're not going to make someone wear a mask.
Yeah.
It just, none of it makes any sense to me.
Yep.
Why we're not just there for everybody is
right. My body, my choice only applies to them.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. So.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These are tough stories.
They're very tough.
And
it's funny because when I a lot of times I read them to Richard. Yeah. And he said, like you did, we didn't hear that in Sunday school.
Yeah.
And no, you didn't.
No, we didn't.
No.
All right. Well, I'll say a quick prayer, and then I'm 3 minutes late for my other Bible study, but I'm not leading today. So
okay.
Let us pray. God of justice and mercy and grace, when you challenge us with these stories that are in this holy text, help us to see your vision. Help us to see and understand why these analogies were used in the first place, and how we can reconcile the fact that these analogies no longer work with what we know as your love. Help us when our faith struggles to deal with these stories. And help all the women, all the girls, all who are the Hagars of this world, stuck in power systems through no fault of their own. Help all who are nameless and caught in the whirlwind of violence and terror. Give us the strength to hear these stories that are difficult, to talk about them, and to be inspired to actually go forward in real love, to break the systems of bondage that hold us all so captive. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Andrea. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes.
Deacon's meeting. Okay.